Welcome back everyone to a new episode in our Rise of Bread series. We have finally digested last episode's Roman rolls and are now making a big jump in time, right? To feudal Europe, or more specifically, the Middle Ages. We will make bread for three types of people. The noble, this could be any type of lord, a local duke, or even a king. The peasant, albeit a well-off one. And lastly, the pauper, who would come begging at the rich man's gate. However, we first have to address the issue of bread leavening in the Middle Ages. Throughout this series, we've been using sourdough, and it would be fine to keep using that. Sourdough was still widely used in the Middle Ages, especially in Southern Europe. However, we now have to get to the issue of beer yeast. Using beer as a leaven for bread goes back all the way to the Sumerians, who we've covered in this series. And Pliny the Elder, him again, said that this was the way that the Gauls leavened their bread. Sourdough, or previous day dough, was of course fine in the nice warm climates of Southern Europe. The climate in Northern Europe, before the arrival of central heating and insulation, was often a bit too cold. Please know that all the recipes in this video can be made with sourdough. Now, the problem is that, unlike sourdough, beer yeast is quite hard to come by. You can buy liquid ones online, a bit pricey for a single loaf though, especially if it might not work. So there are ways around it. The easiest way is to swap all the water with ale and then bloom some fresh yeast in this ale. This will leaven the dough easily while still imparting that beery taste. Alternatively, you can make what was called thick beer in medieval Poland. This is in essence normal sourdough starter, but made with a low alcoholic wheat beer rather than water. A more beery way of leavening, i.e. using the yeast from the actual beer, involves creating what brewers call a yeast starter. Get yourself some bottle-conditioned beer. The more unpasteurized and unfiltered, the better. Then open the bottle and gently pour it into a glass, leaving about 1 centimeter of liquid in the bottle. Drink the glass. Yes, go on, you've earned it. We're going to take 250 milliliters of water and add 25 grams of dried malt extract to this. You can use different amounts. Just make sure you always have a 1:10 ratio, which is very easy to do in metric. Bring the water to a boil for about a minute, making sure all the dried malt extract has dissolved properly. Pour this into a very well cleaned jar. We are brewing a mini beer here, so everything needs to be sterilized. Let this boiled mixture, which a brewer would call wort, cool down to room temperature. Once cooled down, add the dregs, which you've set aside, and give it a good swirl. Cover this with tin foil. You want to make sure no contaminants get in there, but that a small amount of oxygen can still seep through. Put this in a prominent place in your kitchen and give it a swirl each time you walk past. You can't overstir this, just make sure it's always nicely aerated. How long this takes will depend on a lot of factors, so we can't give you a definite timeline here, as a lot will depend on the temperature, quality of the malt, etc. Once foam begins to form at the top and it has a nice thick layer of sediment, it should be good to go. And there we have it. Ample ways of making a beer yeast approximation that don't involve you going to your local craft brewery and asking for the sludge left in their fermenters. There is of course another way, but we're not doing it. No. This has to be a manual for people to recreate at home. We really shouldn't do this. It's happening, isn't it? If you really want full authenticity, you have to brew your own ale. We're not going into detail in this episode, but make sure to subscribe, as we will explore this further in the future. If you already brewed your own beer, let the thrup settle for about 20 minutes and pour over the milky head. Leave this milky substance to settle in the fridge for about 24 hours. The bottom of this container is now pure liquid beer yeast. Use it for brewing or baking. Now that we have our yeast, we can bake our bread, starting with the peasant's bread. If times were good, and we are assuming they were, European peasants would have access to wheat flour, so we're using plain wholemeal for half of the bread. The other half will be rye, which was cheaper and formed the backbone of a peasant's diet. We will also need some water and salt. Lastly, we will be leavening this with our yeast starter. Mix the two flours in one bowl and then split it out again in two bowls. So each bowl is about half wheat, half rye. Now add your salt to one bowl and set this one aside until the next day. Take the other bowl and add all of your water and liquid yeast. Stir this vigorously into a slurry. Yes, vigorously, as these flours are quite thirsty and will start clumping. Once it all has nicely liquefied, cover and leave overnight. Make sure to leave enough space, as this will grow quite a bit larger and creep out of containers that are too small. The next morning, clean up the spillover if you have to, and pour in the other bowl of flour, the salted one. Mix it all in and start kneading. Since half of this is rye, it will be reminiscent of those pre-gluten doughs. Don't expect this to become a bouncy ball of dough. Once it all starts coming together, give it a fine coating with wheat flour and shape it into a ball. Let this now rise for 2 hours. Once it's risen, we're going to give it a medieval looking shape. Shaping was often done with a mold block, so we are going to use a well-floured deep plate to give it a typical medieval shape, as seen in this painting by Rubel, where breads are shown on a table on top of the head of a nun. Huh. Alright, quite odd. We are only going to prove these post-shaping for the time it takes the oven to get up to 205 degrees Celsius. Now, score the bread, pop it in and leave it to bake for 205 degrees Celsius for 15 minutes. After 15 minutes, reduce it to 190 degrees. After another 15 minutes, reduce it to 175 degrees. Then leave it in for a final 20 minutes. This mimics the slowly reducing temperature in medieval ovens, which used the heat from an extinguished fire. Proudly take your peasant's bread out of the oven. Now don't eat it yet, as anyone who's made rye bread will tell you, it's better the next day. Now we're going to turn to the bread of the noble, the Manchet. It comes to us via The Good Hoofswife's Handmaid, by Thomas Dawson, we think, from 1594. Which admittedly is quite late for a medieval recipe, but it is the earliest English one we have. The book gives us not one, but 2 Manchet recipes. The first one is pretty straightforward. Fine flour, ale yeast, water, mix, knead, shape, oven, done. We are going to make the second recipe though, the Manchets of Lady Grey. Firstly, we need 2 pecks of double bolted flour, which roughly corresponds with 20 kilograms of flour. But don't worry, we are going to reduce that by dividing it by 20. If you really want to see the humans struggle with enormous amounts of flour, go check out our previous video. We're using just 1 kilogram of plain white flour, the closest approximation to twice bolted wheat from the recipe. So let's go through the other ingredients to see how much we will need. And put in that water as much leaven as a crab? Or a pretty big apple? Where did it and as much white salt as will crab? Is it half an eggshell or is it a complete eggshell as in 2 halves glued back together? Oh, okay, stop. There is a simple solution to this. Our saviour, William Rubel. He is the author of the book that a lot of this series is based on, and he broke down this recipe on his blog, providing us with percentages. Thanks, William. Now, without further ado, how does one make Lady Grey's Manchet rolls? As said before, we are using 1 kilogram of plain white flour. In addition to this, we'll need 475 milliliters of water, a tablespoon of sourdough, 7 grams of salt, and 125 milliliters of balm or our yeast starter. What's special about this recipe is that the pre-ferment happens inside the flour, something we at least have never seen before. As per the recipe, we will take our flour and make a little hole in it. Put your tablespoon of sourdough in the hole, add half of your balm or yeast starter. Now stir and gently take flour from the sides until the mixture in the middle becomes a thick batter. If it gets too dry and clumpy, just add some of your water. Once that's achieved, cover it up with flour from the sides. But don't mix it any further. Add the salt on top so you can't forget it later. Let it sit for 2.5 hours. After 2.5 hours, you might see some activity, but don't worry if it doesn't look as dramatic as this. Make a new hole and start adding in the remainder of your water, along with the remainder of the yeast. Now start kneading like you would any normal dough. The dough will quickly become a coherent ball. Yes, you can even do the beloved window pane test. Cover it again and let it rest for another 2 hours. Take the dough and roll it into rolls of between 100 and 200 grams, depending on your preference. While you are doing this, preheat your oven to 110 degrees Celsius. Yes, only 110. Yes, I know that's a weirdly low number for bread, but trust me on this one. As soon as they're all prepped, put them in the oven. As with the peasant bread, this is a quirk of the era, straight from shaping to baking. Now we leave them in there for an hour, after which they will come out almost looking like weird meringue mushrooms. Which is how they should look, pale. Because what is the use of having twice bolted white flour if you can't show off how white it is? Now we have our last bread to complete our feudal feast. Firstly, we'll do the peasant's meal, whose bread we first have to cut which can now be served with some lovely mushy peas and a piece of succulent bacon. His bread, known as a trencher, serves both as a source of carbs and a plate. The nobleman would have his manchet with some stew. If he was really rich, it would have been beef stew or even chicken stew, because only the decadently wealthy would eat an animal that produces food. Although the noble would have probably had a pewter plate or some sort, chances are he would have still had this served on a hollowed out trencher, probably to save on washing dishes. And thus we have our medieval feast. Enjoy! Oh yes, the pauper. So, while the rich man was dining in his castle, the poor man would be waiting at his gate. Then, when the rich were done eating, they would give their trenchers to the dogs or the poor. These breads would be eaten like this or dissolved into a porridge or gruel. So, all would have their feudal feast, even if they didn't like it very much. We'll be back in 2 weeks with the bread from just before and just after the French Revolution. As always, we really hope you enjoyed this episode on medieval bread. Please leave a comment below as to which other breads or recipes you would like to see us try. Maybe we'll turn them into an extra episode. It would be amazing if you left a like, and even more amazing if you subscribed. Thank you very much for watching.